Hey everyone, this is Papa Likes Comics, and if you like what you see on this channel, hit the subscribe button and that little bell for notifications of new videos when they're posted.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. It won't be.
If you're smuggling a child, then we're going to prosecute you. And that child will be separated from you probably as required by law.
This is a problem that president after president has dealt with for decades. This one is willing to stand up and fix it. We ask Congress to do their part. Thank you, sir, for your leadership.
Thank you very much. Great job.
Today I'm talking with Julio Anta. He's the writer of Image Comics' new 5-issue series called Home that takes place during a time of migration surge at the southern U.S. border. So Julio, before we get into your book, tell us a little about yourself. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? And what did you study?
Sure. So I grew up in Miami. I live in New York now. And I've been in New York for the last 10 years now, but I spent my whole childhood in Miami, went to Miami-Dade College over there, studying journalism. And then I came to New York, and I've been living here for the last 10 years.
Did you want to be like a news reporter? I mean, how did you take that turn in your career?
Yeah, I wanted to do music journalism. And that's really how I first started writing. I would do, album reviews, that kind of thing online, interviews. And then, I grew up playing music, so that was a huge part of my life too. And then when I came to New York, I just took a regular job. Eventually I felt that desire to write again. But it was really the story of Home that brought me into writing comics. Because when I had the idea for Home initially, I wasn't writing any comics yet. So I kind of taught myself how to write comics, all in service of writing the story of Home.
And you mentioned comics, so and I'm a fan of comics. And are you did you grow up reading comic books? Do you collect comics? I mean, you're in New York, you're like in an epicenter of the comic culture.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up on manga mostly. I went to this like anime store, and I saw that they had what I would later find out is regular, North American comics. And this was around the time of Civil War, the event. And that's what got me into, North American comics for the first time, because up until then it was all, manga and anime for me. And I've pretty much kept it up ever since. So when I decided that I wanted to tell, the story that I was thinking about with Home, comics felt like the obvious way to do it.
So Home is Image Comics, and I'm a fan of Image. I've seen them from I have the first Image Comics that they came out, the whole Rob Liefeld era, the Young Blood, nice, and all that stuff from the 90s. And look how much they've grown today, right? I mean, they are
it's incredible.
Third publisher. So are you into, and I like the independent stories a lot more than the big DC Marvel kind of superhero thing. Long time ago I moved away from that, and I wanted more stories that resonated with me, right, at my age and my stage in life. And when I read Home, I got to tell you, I was like, wow, what is this story? So Home is your first published work, right? So tell us, how was that process of building a story? How'd you find an artist? Does the publisher find the artist? And how'd you find the publisher? And kind of give us how did you go about it? Because there's probably people out there who want to get their material published. I'm one of them. I'm writing a couple of stories all at the same time. And I want to know about your experience in that world.
Yeah. So like I said, I hadn't written any comics by the time I came up with the idea for Home. Now, in the spring of 2018 is when family separation started at the border. And it was something that really affected me. It's something that, I mean, we're both from Miami. My background is Cuban and Colombian. My father was a Cuban refugee as a child. My mother's parents were undocumented from Colombia, which are obviously two very different experiences.
We can either release all illegal immigrant families and minors who show up at the border from Central America, or we can arrest the adults for the federal crime of illegal entry.
But, thinking about my father as a 3-year-old coming here as a refugee, I saw him and I saw my own 3-year-old son at the time in the eyes of these kids who are being torn away from their parents as a cruel form of deterrence, So it really affected me. I found myself getting incredibly invested and researching a lot and just reading everything that I could, listening to interviews with families who had been separated, and just being consumed by the entire thing. Eventually I thought of the idea for Home, and it felt like I was finding a positive a positive way to kind of take these feelings of betrayal and everything that I was feeling, seeing this happening, and steer it towards a positive outlet. But like I said, I didn't know how to write comics. I didn't know anything yet. I was just a comic reader, and kind of like, obviously with yourself too, but I think with a lot of comic readers, we all read comics and we think at a certain point, we're like, you know what, I think I could do this too,
Yeah.
So I started trying to figure out how does this work? How does the industry work when it comes to, how does Image Comics, for example, find the stories and the books that they're going to publish? How do you get it in their hands? And I got some really good advice from Ed Brisson, a writer. And he said this focus on short stories. So that's what I did, because everyone kind of comes into comics wanting to write the thing that they're most passionate about, like I did with Home. But most people come in with, they want to do a 100-issue series or, a trilogy of graphic novels. For me, it was a 5-issue miniseries. But I knew that as somebody who'd never done anything, that was already too much to just go up to Image, who doesn't know me, or go up to any publisher and say, hey, I want to do this 5-issue miniseries on something that, a lot of people will find controversial. So I started doing short stories. So on my website right now, you can see there's 5 short stories that I did there, that I just collaborated with different artists that I'd find online. I'd find them on Twitter or on Reddit, or on Facebook. And that's how I learned how to write comics and learned how to collaborate with artists. But throughout that entire experience, I was doing it all in service to eventually getting to write Home. So I was working on the story the entire time. I was doing research, which, like I mentioned before I even started writing the book, I was already doing a lot of research, but I really dove into it even further when I started writing the book. My scripts are filled with photo references, video references of the locations where the story takes place. It's a lot of screenshots of like Google Street View. So it's really, I wanted to make sure that the book was as real as possible. And also that it portrayed these characters in an empathetic way, not in a way that was exploitative.
Yeah, I mean, you're framing this mother and son story in this humanitarian crisis that's going on. And I was thinking, wow, this is his first published work. I mean, you jumped into really the fire. I mean, you could have picked anything to really put the mother and son story. When I was reading that issue, I got drawn into that story of Mercedes and her son Juan, and they were, fleeing the violence in Central America, the corruption, the gang crime. So you mentioned about research. Did you research a little bit? Did you talk to people? Tell us about that how did you engulf yourself in that world?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it started with, news reports, just the thing that the average person would see. It ended up, I ended up going into like local news, reading local news, listening to interviews with families that were separated. In the 3rd issue, I kind of take something from an interview that I listened to. And it was an interview with a mother whose son had been separated from her. And she had no idea where he even was because, they're separated at the southern border. And then a lot of these kids are shipped all over the country to different shelters and foster homes. Her son in particular ended up in the Bronx, from Texas to the Bronx. And she had no idea how to, A, how to even find out where my kid is, then B, how do I get to him? And during that call, she apologizes for ever even bringing him, because if she knew that this would happen and that they would be separated, she never would have done it. And I think at the premise for all of this is also understanding people's different immigration situations and what is actually happening at the border. So with this story, it's people seeking asylum, which is very different from crossing the border illegally or trying to get by without papers. These are people that are going through a legal process, which is showing up at a port of entry, declaring themselves, which, like I said, is legal. But then what was happening was a process that was illegal, which was taking these children away from the parents, when in reality, what should have happened is they should have been, they should have gotten ankle bracelets, and they should have been, given a court date and allowed to go and be with their family, which is what, in the beginning of the issue, we frame it as, which is, Mercedes has a plan. She knows what she's doing. Her sister-in-law lives in the country, and they're going to go stay with her sister-in-law. But then the unthinkable happens and they're separated. So it was a lot of, for myself, starting to understand a lot of this immigration law that I wasn't familiar with. Like I said, from my background, it's very different than, my father's experience as a Cuban, or my mother's parents' experience. So it was a lot of researching that and just listening to a lot of interviews, watching a lot of videos, and just, kind of surrounding myself with all of it, so that I could present a story that, was authentic. But like I said, also at the end of the day, there's that top level of politics that a lot of people listen to on the news. But this was more about how do those things affect two characters, and how does it affect this boy in particular? Yep. So that's really what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be a really personal story, with the backbone of it being, the research and the facts of what the politics and the law is, but really focus on them.
Right, and you mentioned the boy. So, I mean, there's a twist in this story. We're not going to mention it. We're not going to give it away. But but there is a twist to this story, right? I mean, I think for the sake of this interview, let's let people just say it's maybe more than an immigration story. There's something else.
Sure.
There's something else that the reader is going to find out at the end of book one. That I guess you're going to develop it over the course of the next 4 books.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's in the solicitation. I feel like most people who are going to read this book are going to go in knowing that there is a superhuman element to it. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a story about survival. It's not a superhero book, but it's a book about a young boy trying to survive in a new place alone, while also grappling with these newfound abilities that he's found himself with.
Tell us a little bit about the artist. I mean, how do you pronounce her name?
Anna Weisacek.
Weisacek. So what about her work? How did you find her? How did you connect with her?
Yeah, so it's kind of a crazy story. Not really what most image books. That's not the origin story of the writer and the artist. But she's a Polish artist who has worked with companies like Black Mask. She did a book with Boom as well. But I found her on Reddit. Like I said, this was the first idea I ever had to make a comic. And before I made all those mini comics that I told you about, I actually started working with her on Home first. I kind of pivoted to doing those mini comics, but there's a subreddit called something like comic book collaborations. And at the time, I didn't know how to find an artist. I had no credits. Nobody knew who I was. So I went on this subreddit and I essentially just wrote like almost like a newspaper listing, where it was like, here's a couple of sentences about the story that I want to write. I'm looking for an artist with this kind of style who's willing to develop this pitch with me, and potentially do a miniseries together. And a lot of people responded, but she was the one who, felt like the best fit for me. And luckily it worked out. I don't think many people can go on Reddit, find an artist, and then, end up with an artist as good as she is.
So Julio, I want to ask you, any future projects? What do you have working on? Are you going to develop some other story for another publisher? What's the future look like for you in terms of your project?
Yeah, I mean, I got a bunch of stuff. Most of it I can't talk about yet. But another book I have announced already is called Frontera, and that's a YA graphic novel. So it's for, younger readers, I'd say like 13 to 17, and it's going to be published by Harper Alley. They are they're HarperCollins's YA graphic novel imprint. So that's a book that I'm doing with Jacoby Salcedo. He's a frequent collaborator of mine. We 3 of the 5 mini comics that I have on my website are with him, and he's also the artist for cover B on the home covers.
Gotcha.
So he did a series of all the covers, and it's a 200-page graphic novel. I like to call it a supernatural border adventure. It's about a 16-year-old kid. He lived in the U.S., had no idea what his status was. He was deported back to Mexico when he found out that he was undocumented. His parents sent him back, and he's on a journey through the Sonoran Desert when he meets a ghost of another migrant who had passed away half a century ago. And, the ghost helps him on his journey. They talk about, the parallels between what the situation was when the ghost was alive 50 years ago and what his current situation is. And it kind of speaks to the parallels of, how it's kind of the same old thing that we're still going through, just in different, framed in different ways. But yeah, so that's a book that I've written already. Jacoby is in the middle of illustrating right now, and that's set for the summer of 2023.
Awesome. Wow. I mean, I like that you're talking about these unique Hispanic experiences in the country. And as a kid growing up in New York and in Miami, I didn't have Hispanic characters in comic book. I mean, it was Tony Stark, it was Steve Rogers, it was Bruce Wayne. And then when those Hispanic type characters, the villains, Tarantula, or all these other characters started coming up, I started to see a reflection of myself in the books. And now it's and they're out there. And I want to congratulate you for taking that Hispanic experience, that voice, and putting it into a let's say a mainstream or a big publisher's hands.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's important because even me growing up, I didn't see myself in anything. I didn't see myself on TV, outside of the telenovelas that my grandma would watch, but like in American TV, I didn't see myself in anything, in comics, in movies. And now we're starting to see some characters. We're starting to see Miles Morales, America Chavez, but it's still few and far between. And there are also characters that I really enjoy the current Miles run. I think the writer's doing a really good job with him, despite also not being a Latino writer. But a lot of these characters, they're created by white people who are trying to have that Hispanic voice, or they are the Hispanic version of another character. So I think now we're starting to see characters that are Hispanic, that are written by Hispanic creators, and that are also not a version of another character. I don't read many Big Two comics. That's not really my lane. For me, it's more, like you mentioned, a lot of the indie publishers, graphic novels. But I think it's important. I think it's important for people of all ages to see themselves reflected in the media. I think that, it's a fact that Hispanic people are the least represented across all media in the US, especially compared to the amount of media that we consume. And I think that's even more so in comic books. I think it's even more exaggerated than in movie and in TV. So I think it's important that when I have the opportunity to write for whatever publisher, that I bring these positive portrayals of people like us, because I did grow up, like I said, hardly seeing us, but then when I did, it was the villain, it was the drug dealer, it was the housekeeper.
Stereotype.
Yeah, it wasn't these real, positive, multifaceted characterizations of people like we are in real life. So for me, I feel like we are seeing it now. There are, Hispanic creators trying to put out comics that do speak to that experience. So I'm just happy to contribute to it and hopefully show publishers like Image that there is a market for books that speak to these experiences,
Yeah, we were talking about this at my local comic shop about what a great medium the comic book, the graphic novel is to talk about social issues, race issues, gender identity. I mean, it's a great medium and it lends itself for it. And you've got the beautiful artwork to go along with it. So yeah, I think it's an awesome vehicle to tell those positive stories, those Hispanic positive stories.
Thanks. Yeah, and there's also a history of using comics for speaking to social issues. Obviously, the X-Men, Superman. There's, even though we may not see that in current portrayals of characters like Superman, at the heart of it was trying to tell the story of an immigrant in a strange place. And I think that we should be trying to get back to that with comics. So I'm happy to be doing at least a small part in following that tradition.
I want to thank Julio Anta for taking the time to talk about his 5-issue series Home from Image Comics, and it's available April 14th, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. First issue.
Julio, how do we follow you? Are you on Instagram? Where are you?
Yeah, it's just my name, Julio Anta, is Twitter, Instagram, my website also, julioanta.com. You can read, I mentioned I have 5, mini comics ranging in 4 to like 10 pages that you can read there for free. And there's links to, how you can find an issue of Home, whether it's at a local shop or ordering it online.
Great. Well, thanks, Julio. And guys, please subscribe to the channel for more comic book related content. Take care.